Power corrupts, but absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys the human mind entirely. Throughout history, kings and emperors who wielded unlimited authority over millions of lives gradually descended into madness so profound that their subjects lived in terror of their next whim. Today we examine 11 monarchs whose habits were so disturbing, so utterly insane that they challenge our understanding of human sanity itself. These weren't merely eccentric rulers with quirky preferences. These were men whose unchecked power transformed them into something barely recognizable as human. From emperors who believed they were made of glass, to kings who held military tribunals for rats. These stories reveal the darkest truths about what happens when no one can say no to a ruler's increasingly deranged demands. The accounts you're about to hear are documented historical facts, preserved in court records, diplomatic correspondences, and the terrified testimonies of those who witnessed these monarchs' descent into madness. What makes these stories particularly chilling is not just their grotesque nature, but their historical accuracy. These weren't mythical tyrants or fictional monsters. They were real men who ruled real kingdoms, making decisions that affected millions of lives while trapped in the prison of their own shattered minds. Each case study demonstrates how the isolation of absolute power, combined with the inability of anyone to challenge or correct a king's behavior, creates the perfect conditions for a complete psychological breakdown. The progression from eccentric ruler to dangerous madman follows a disturbingly consistent pattern across cultures and centuries. Initially, these monarchs displayed merely unusual preferences or behaviors that courtiers learned to accommodate. However, as their power solidified and opposition disappeared, these quirks evolved into increasingly extreme and harmful obsessions. Modern psychology recognizes many of these behaviors as symptoms of severe mental illness, conditions that today might be treated with therapy and medication. However, in their historical context, these kings' madness was often interpreted as divine punishment, demonic possession, or simply the natural consequence of royal blood. Their subjects had no choice but to endure whatever horrors their diseased minds could conceive. The human cost of these rulers' insanity extended far beyond the palace walls. Entire kingdoms suffered under the weight of their kings' delusions, with resources squandered on bizarre projects, innocent people executed for imaginary crimes, and diplomatic relations destroyed by incomprehensible behavior. These stories serve as a stark reminder that unchecked power doesn't just corrupt, it can completely destroy the human psyche. James I of England. James I of England ascended to the throne in 1603, bringing with him a collection of personal habits so revolting that even his most loyal courtiers struggled to remain in his presence. Despite his reputation as a learned scholar and the commissioner of the famous King James Bible, this monarch's relationship with basic hygiene was so catastrophically poor that it became a defining characteristic of his reign. The king's aversion to bathing was legendary throughout Europe. Court records describe a man who went months without washing, believing that water weakened the body and made it susceptible to disease. His unwashed hair became a breeding ground for an army of lice so extensive that courtiers could actually hear them moving when they stood close to the king. The infestation was so severe that the parasites would fall from his head onto official documents during state meetings. His breath was described by the Venetian ambassador as putrid beyond description, a condition that made private audiences nearly unbearable for foreign dignitaries. The king's teeth, blackened and rotting from neglect, and a diet heavy in sugared fruits, contributed to an oral odor so powerful that it could clear a room. Court physicians, too terrified to suggest proper dental care, instead offered the king strong wines and perfumed waters that did nothing to address the underlying problems. James's clothing, never properly cleaned, accumulated layers of grease, food stains, and bodily fluids that created a permanent stench around his person. The silk doublets and velvet robes that should have represented royal magnificence instead became repositories of filth. Courtiers learned to position themselves upwind of the king during ceremonies, and many developed the habit of breathing through their mouths when forced into close proximity with their sovereign. The psychological implications of James's hygiene habits extended beyond mere personal preference. His deliberate rejection of cleanliness seemed to represent a fundamental disconnection from the social norms that even the lowest peasants understood. This wasn't ignorance. James was highly educated and certainly aware of basic hygiene practices. Instead, his filthiness appeared to be an assertion of royal privilege taken to its most disgusting extreme. Foreign visitors often left England with tales of the unwashed king that damaged diplomatic relationships and England's reputation across Europe. French courtiers, themselves no strangers to irregular bathing habits, were nonetheless shocked by James's condition. Spanish ambassadors reported home that the English king's appearance and smell made formal negotiations extremely difficult to conduct with appropriate dignity. The tragedy of James I lies not just in his personal degradation, but in how his unchecked power allowed him to impose his revolting presence on everyone around him. No one possessed the authority to demand that their king maintain basic human cleanliness, and so an entire court was forced to endure the consequences of one man's descent into filthy madness. Charles VI of France. In the annals of royal madness, few delusions have been as persistent or as tragic as that of Charles VI of France, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. This monarch, known to history as Charles the Mad, developed a psychological condition so bizarre that it challenges our understanding of the human mind's capacity for self-deception. Charles became absolutely convinced that his body was made entirely of glass, a delusion that dominated the final decades of his life and terrorized his entire kingdom. The king's glass delusion, known today as glass delusion syndrome, manifested in the most extreme ways imaginable. Charles refused to allow anyone to touch him, convinced that even the slightest contact would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He would stand motionless for hours, afraid that any sudden movement might cause catastrophic breakage. Court sessions became surreal displays of a king frozen in terror of his own imagined fragility. To accommodate his delusion, court tailors were ordered to sew iron rods into the king's clothing, creating a primitive but effective suit of armor designed to protect his supposedly glass body from accidental damage. These metal reinforcements made his royal robes incredibly heavy and cumbersome, but Charles insisted they were necessary to prevent him from cracking under the weight of normal movement. The sight of their king encased in this bizarre protective garment became a daily reminder of his complete psychological collapse. The practical implications of ruling a kingdom while believing oneself to be made of glass proved nearly impossible to manage. Charles could not sit normally on his throne, instead requiring specially padded seats that he believed would cushion his glass body. He refused to ride horses, walk on stone floors, or participate in any court ceremonies that might involve physical contact. State business ground to a halt as the king became increasingly paralyzed by his irrational fears. His delusion extended to his sleeping arrangements, where Charles demanded that his bed be surrounded by cushions and soft materials to prevent injury should he roll over during the night. He employed servants whose sole responsibility was to ensure that no hard objects came within arm's reach of their glass king. The royal chambers were stripped of anything that might pose a threat to his imagined crystalline structure. Foreign ambassadors reported home about the impossibility of conducting normal diplomatic relations with a monarch who believed he would shatter if someone shook his hand. Treaty negotiations became elaborate pantomimes where documents had to be placed on tables for the king to read rather than handed to him directly. The dignity and authority of the French crown suffered immeasurable damage as word spread throughout Europe about their glass king. The most tragic aspect of Charles VI's condition was its duration. This delusion persisted for over 30 years, essentially ending effective royal governance in France during one of the most crucial periods in European history. While his kingdom faced wars, economic crisis, and social upheaval, their king remained trapped in a prison of glass, too terrified of breaking to function as the leader his people desperately needed. Peter III of Russia. Peter III of Russia reigned for only 6 months in 1762, but his brief time on the throne revealed a level of psychological immaturity so profound that it bordered on complete dissociation from reality. This 34-year-old emperor approached the governance of the largest empire on earth with the mentality of a child playing with toys, transforming the serious business of statecraft into elaborate games that horrified his court and ultimately led to his downfall. The emperor's obsession with toy soldiers and war games reached levels that defied comprehension. Peter maintained enormous collections of miniature armies, complete with tiny cannons, cavalry units, and infantry formations that he would arrange and rearrange for hours each day. These weren't merely casual diversions, they became the primary focus of his attention, taking precedence over actual military affairs and state business. Court officials were forced to wait for hours while their emperor played with dolls. Peter's war games extended beyond simple toy arrangement into elaborate theatrical productions that consumed entire days. He would force members of his court to participate in mock battles, assigning them roles as different army units and requiring them to march around the palace following his shouted commands. Grown men, many of them accomplished military officers and government officials, were reduced to crawling around on their hands and knees, pretending to be toy soldiers for their emperor's amusement. The emperor's disconnect from reality became even more apparent in his treatment of actual military personnel. Peter would conduct formal military tribunals for rats that he claimed had committed acts of desertion and cowardice. His proceedings followed proper military protocol, complete with charges read aloud, testimony from witnesses, and formal sentencing. The rats, whether dead or alive, would be subjected to military punishment, including execution by hanging from tiny gallows that Peter had specially constructed for this purpose. His childish approach to governance extended to his handling of diplomatic relations, where Peter would insist on conducting negotiations while playing with his toy soldiers. Foreign ambassadors reported the surreal experience of discussing trade agreements and military alliances while the Emperor of Russia moved toy cavalry units around a sandbox. These displays of complete immaturity destroyed Russia's credibility on the international stage and left diplomats questioning whether they were dealing with a sovereign nation or an elaborate practical joke. Peter's inability to distinguish between play and reality created chaos throughout the Russian government. He would issue military orders based on the outcomes of his toy battles, promoting and demoting real officers according to how well their miniature counterparts had performed in his imaginary wars. Actual military strategy was abandoned in favor of tactics that worked well with wooden soldiers, but had no basis in real-world combat effectiveness. The emperor's wife, Catherine, later Catherine the Great, watched in horror as her husband's childish obsessions threatened to destroy the empire. His courtiers, many of whom had served under previous rulers with distinction, found themselves trapped in a nightmare where the fate of millions depended on the whims of a man who preferred toy soldiers to real ones. Peter's reign ended when Catherine organized a coup that removed him from power, but not before his 6 months of toy soldier governance had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of placing unlimited power in the hands of someone completely disconnected from adult reality. King Farouk of Egypt. King Farouk of Egypt, who ruled from 1936 to 1952, transformed the ancient dignity of pharaonic power into a grotesque display of compulsive theft, sexual obsession, and material greed that shocked even the most jaded observers of royal excess. This monarch, who inherited one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Middle East, developed habits so bizarre and criminal that they would eventually contribute to the complete collapse of the Egyptian monarchy. Farouk's compulsive stealing became legendary throughout diplomatic circles, earning him a reputation as the most accomplished royal pickpocket in history. No object was safe from his grasping fingers. He would steal watches from the wrists of dignitaries, fountain pens from the pockets of ambassadors, and jewelry from the necks of women attending state functions. Most famously, he successfully pickpocketed a watch from Winston Churchill during a diplomatic meeting, a theft so audacious that it became international news and permanently damaged Egypt's standing with Britain. The king's obsession with red automobiles bordered on the pathological. Farouk maintained a collection of over 200 red cars, from fire engines to Ferraris, all painted in various shades of crimson. He would spend hours each day inspecting his fleet, often ordering his mechanics to repaint vehicles if their red wasn't precisely the correct shade. A law was actually changed to ensure that only the king could own a red vehicle, making the possession of red cars by anyone else a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment. Perhaps most disturbing was Farouk's accumulation of pornographic material, which became so extensive that it was considered the largest private collection in the world. The king employed a staff of dozens whose sole responsibility was cataloging and maintaining his vast library of explicit materials from every corner of the globe. He would spend entire days viewing his collection, often neglecting important state business to indulge in his obsession. The storage and maintenance of this material required an entire wing of the royal palace. Farouk's eating habits reached levels of excess that defied medical explanation. He would consume meals consisting of dozens of courses, often eating continuously for hours without stopping. Palace records show single meals that included multiple whole chickens, entire sides of beef, and desserts numbering in the dozens. His obesity became so extreme that special furniture had to be constructed to support his weight, and diplomatic protocols had to be adjusted to accommodate his physical limitations. The king's sexual appetites were equally excessive and indiscriminate. He maintained a harem that included hundreds of women from across the Mediterranean, many of whom were essentially kidnapped and held against their will. His sexual demands were so constant and extreme that palace physicians expressed concern about his health, while the women in his harem lived in a state of terror about when they might be summoned to satisfy his insatiable needs. The psychological profile that emerges from Farouk's behavior suggests a man completely consumed by immediate gratification, unable to delay or control any impulse regardless of its social or political consequences. His stealing wasn't motivated by need. He was one of the wealthiest men on earth, but by a compulsive inability to resist taking anything that caught his attention. This same lack of impulse control extended to every aspect of his life, from eating to sex to the accumulation of useless objects. The ultimate tragedy of Farouk's reign lies in how his personal obsessions consumed resources and attention that should have been devoted to governing Egypt during a crucial period in Middle Eastern history. While his people struggled with poverty and his nation faced complex political challenges, their king remained focused entirely on satisfying his endless appetites for food, sex, and stolen trinkets. King Martin of Aragon. King Martin of Aragon's death in 1410 represents one of the most bizarre and tragic examples of how even positive emotions, when taken to extremes, can prove fatal for those whose minds have been warped by absolute power. This monarch, known for his generally pleasant disposition and love of humor, died in circumstances so absurd that they challenge our understanding of the relationship between psychological state and physical health. The events leading to Martin's death began during a royal feast, celebrating a successful hunting expedition. The king had enjoyed a particularly elaborate meal, consuming quantities of food that would have challenged even the most robust constitution. Court records describe a banquet featuring multiple courses of roasted meats, rich sauces, elaborate pastries, and copious amounts of wine. By the evening's end, Martin was already suffering from severe indigestion and should have retired to bed to recover. Instead, one of his courtiers chose that moment to regale the king with what would prove to be a fatal joke about a deer they had encountered during the hunt. The specific content of the joke has been lost to history, but its effect on the overfed monarch was immediate and catastrophic. Martin began laughing with such intensity that he was unable to stop, his body convulsing with uncontrollable mirth that quickly evolved from amusing to alarming. What began as hearty laughter transformed into something far more sinister. The king's breathing became irregular as his diaphragm spasmed uncontrollably. His face turned red and then purple, and tears streamed down his cheeks as his body shook with violent convulsions. Court physicians rushed to his aid, but they had no experience treating someone whose laughter had become a medical emergency. Medieval medicine offered no solutions for a king literally dying of amusement. The laughter continued for what witnesses described as an unbearably long time, with Martin completely unable to regain control of his physical responses. His overstuffed stomach, already strained from the enormous meal, was subjected to violent contractions that may have caused internal damage. The combination of extreme physical exertion from uncontrolled laughter and the stress of excessive eating created a perfect storm of physiological crisis. Modern medical analysis suggests that Martin may have suffered from what we now understand as a fatal case of syncope, a condition where extreme laughter can trigger cardiovascular collapse in someone whose system is already stressed. The king's death was likely caused by a combination of factors: severe overeating, alcohol consumption, and the physical trauma of prolonged, uncontrollable laughter that his body simply could not withstand. The psychological implications of Martin's death extend beyond the immediate medical crisis. This was a man so accustomed to indulgence, so removed from normal human limitations, that he literally could not control his own responses to stimuli. His death by laughter represents the ultimate expression of a life lived without moderation or self-restraint, where even positive emotions became weapons capable of destroying him. The courtiers who witnessed Martin's death were traumatized by the experience of watching their king laugh himself to death. Many reported that they could never again enjoy humor without remembering the sight of their monarch convulsing with fatal mirth. The joke that killed the king was never repeated, and some courtiers reportedly developed a phobia of laughter that lasted for the rest of their lives. Christian VII of Denmark. Christian VII of Denmark ascended to the throne in 1766 at age 17, bringing with him a collection of mental disturbances so severe that his 43-year reign became a sustained nightmare for everyone in his kingdom. This monarch's behavior went far beyond mere eccentricity or royal privilege. It represented a complete breakdown of human social behavior that terrorized his subjects and created chaos throughout Scandinavian politics. The king's unpredictable violence became legendary throughout Copenhagen and beyond. Christian would attack people without warning or provocation, striking courtiers, servants, and even foreign dignitaries with whatever object happened to be within reach. His assaults followed no logical pattern. A friendly conversation could instantly transform into a beating if something in the king's diseased mind triggered his rage. No one was safe from his sudden outbursts, creating an atmosphere of constant terror throughout the royal court. Perhaps most bizarrely, Christian developed an obsession with the children's game of leapfrog that consumed hours of his daily schedule. The king would force ambassadors, government ministers, and visiting dignitaries to participate in extended leapfrog sessions, regardless of their age, physical condition, or the dignity of their office. These games often lasted for hours, with the king becoming violently angry if anyone refused to participate or failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for jumping over each other's backs. The monarch's relationship with animals reached levels of absurdity that shocked even his most tolerant subjects. Christian promoted his pet dog to the rank of government minister, complete with an official title, salary, and place at the council table. The dog attended cabinet meetings, where the king would solicit its opinion on matters of state policy and claim to understand its barked responses. When the animal died, Christian ordered a state funeral complete with military honors and a period of national mourning. His sexual behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing as his mental condition deteriorated. Christian would expose himself publicly without warning, masturbate during state ceremonies, and make inappropriate sexual advances toward anyone who caught his attention, regardless of their age, gender, or social position. Court officials developed elaborate protocols to shield visitors from the king's sexual exhibitionism, but his unpredictability made protection impossible to guarantee. The king's eating habits reflected his complete disconnection from normal human behavior. Christian would consume food like an animal, tearing at meat with his hands, throwing scraps on the floor, and often eating garbage or inedible objects that caught his attention. He would sometimes refuse to eat for days, claiming that his food was poisoned, then suddenly gorge himself until he vomited. Meals became public spectacles of degradation that horrified foreign visitors and damaged Denmark's international reputation. Perhaps most tragically, Christian's condition led to his complete manipulation by those around him, particularly his personal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, who became the real power behind the throne. Struensee used the king's mental illness to advance his own political agenda, essentially ruling Denmark through the puppet of a madman while carrying on an affair with the queen. This arrangement created a constitutional crisis that lasted for years and nearly destroyed the Danish monarchy. The human cost of Christian VII's madness extended far beyond the palace walls. His unpredictable behavior created instability that affected diplomatic relations, domestic policy, and the daily lives of ordinary Danes who lived in fear of their king's next incomprehensible decree. The tragedy of his reign demonstrates how mental illness in a position of absolute power can become a national disaster, affecting millions of innocent people who have no choice but to endure the consequences of one man's shattered mind. Caligula, Emperor of Rome. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, transformed the might of the Roman Empire into a stage for displaying madness so profound and terrifying that it redefined the very concept of imperial tyranny. Ruling from 37 to 41 AD, this emperor's descent into complete psychological breakdown created a reign of terror that shocked even a civilization accustomed to violence and excess. His delusions of divinity and obsession with his horse represent some of the most documented cases of absolute power destroying human sanity. Caligula's relationship with his horse, Incitatus, became the defining symbol of his madness and the complete breakdown of Roman governmental institutions. The emperor didn't simply love his horse. He genuinely believed the animal possessed intelligence and capabilities superior to his human advisors. Incitatus was provided with a marble stable, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar studded with precious gems. The horse lived in a luxury that exceeded the comfort enjoyed by most Roman citizens, dining on golden oats while the emperor's subjects struggled with taxation and food shortages. The emperor's plan to appoint Incitatus as a consul of Rome represents perhaps the most insane governmental decision in recorded history. Caligula seriously intended to grant his horse the highest political office in the empire, complete with voting rights in the Senate and authority over military decisions. He would spend hours discussing policy matters with the animal, claiming to understand its responses and incorporating the horse's supposed advice into imperial decrees. Only Caligula's assassination prevented this appointment from becoming reality. Caligula's divine delusions extended far beyond his relationship with his horse. The emperor genuinely believed himself to be various gods, depending on his mood and the political circumstances. He would dress as Jupiter, complete with thunderbolt props and a golden crown, demanding that his subjects worship him as the king of the gods. On other occasions, he claimed to be Apollo, Diana, or even Venus, requiring elaborate costumes and theatrical performances to support each divine identity. The emperor's demand for worship created a reign of terror throughout the empire. Desperate citizens were forced to prostrate themselves before statues of Caligula, offering prayers and sacrifices to their divine emperor under penalty of death. He ordered the construction of temples dedicated to his own worship, diverting enormous resources from essential government functions to support his megalomaniacal delusions. The traditional Roman gods were declared inferior to Emperor Caligula, creating a religious crisis throughout the empire. His conversations with statues of gods became public spectacles that horrified Roman citizens and foreign visitors alike. Caligula would spend hours talking to marble sculptures, sometimes arguing violently with them and occasionally ordering their destruction when they failed to respond appropriately. He claimed to receive direct communications from these statues, using their supposed messages to justify increasingly erratic and destructive policies. The emperor's behavior during public appearances became increasingly bizarre and threatening. He would suddenly interrupt speeches to announce new divine revelations, order random executions based on messages from his horse, or demand that the audience worship him immediately or face death. These events transformed what should have been dignified imperial ceremonies into terrifying displays of madness that left participants traumatized and the empire's reputation in ruins. Caligula's madness represented more than personal psychological breakdown. It demonstrated how absolute power could transform a human being into something that was no longer recognizably human. His delusions weren't merely eccentric beliefs, but fundamental breaks with reality that made rational governance impossible. The empire survived his reign only because he was murdered by his own guards, who recognized that allowing his madness to continue would destroy Rome itself. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II of Bavaria, who ruled from 1864 to 1886, created a fantasy world so elaborate and disconnected from reality that it consumed his kingdom's resources and ultimately led to his mysterious death. Known as the fairy tale king, Ludwig's obsession with recreating medieval romance and fantasy transformed Bavaria into a stage for his elaborate delusions, complete with impossible castles, imaginary dignitaries, and a complete rejection of the responsibilities of kingship. The king's most famous expression of madness was his construction of Neuschwanstein Castle, a medieval fantasy built with 19th-century engineering that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying Ludwig's romantic delusions. This wasn't simply an expensive building project. It was the physical manifestation of a mind completely disconnected from reality. Ludwig spent enormous sums creating a fairy tale castle that existed solely to house his fantasies about knights, medieval romance, and Wagner's operas brought to life. Ludwig's dinner parties with deceased monarchs represent some of the most documented cases of elaborate delusion in royal history. The king would order full formal dinners to be prepared and served for guests who existed only in his imagination. Place settings were laid for long-dead kings and queens, servants bowed to empty chairs, and toasts were offered to invisible companions. Servants were required to participate in these charades, serving multiple courses to ghosts while their king engaged in animated discussions with his imaginary guests. The king's nocturnal lifestyle became increasingly bizarre as his condition deteriorated. Ludwig would sleep during the day and conduct all his activities at night, reversing the normal patterns of court life and government. His nighttime wanderings through his castles became elaborate theatrical productions, where he would dress in costumes representing various historical figures and act out scenes from his favorite operas and legends. His obsession with Richard Wagner's music evolved into a complete confusion between opera and reality. Ludwig genuinely believed that he was living inside Wagner's mythological world, seeing himself as various heroic characters from the composer's works. He would spend entire nights performing operatic scenes alone in his castle rooms, singing to imaginary audiences and creating elaborate staging for productions that existed only in his mind. The king's rejection of modern life became total and absolute. Ludwig refused to acknowledge the Industrial Revolution, the political changes transforming Europe, or even the basic governmental responsibilities of kingship. He lived entirely in an imagined medieval world where knights rescued princesses. Magic was real, and kings ruled through divine right rather than political necessity. His fantasy world provided a complete escape from the complexities of 19th-century European politics. Ludwig's financial extravagance in pursuit of his fantasies nearly bankrupted Bavaria. His castle-building projects, elaborate theatrical productions, and constant reconstruction of his fantasy environments consumed resources that should have been devoted to infrastructure, education, and military preparedness. The king's advisors watched helplessly as their nation's treasury was emptied to fund one man's elaborate delusions. The mysterious circumstances of Ludwig's death, found drowned in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist, remain unexplained to this day. Whether suicide, murder, or accident, his death ended a reign that had transformed a serious European kingdom into a stage set for operatic fantasy. Ludwig's legacy demonstrates how completely a human mind can retreat from reality when given unlimited resources and no external constraints on its most elaborate fantasies. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, who ruled from 1640 to 1648, represents perhaps the most sexually disturbed and violently unstable monarch in recorded history. His reign of terror combined pathological sexual obsession with genocidal rage, creating a nightmare that traumatized an entire empire and ultimately led to his assassination by his own government. Known as Ibrahim the Mad, his 8 years of rule demonstrated how sexual compulsion and unlimited power could transform a human being into a monster. Ibrahim's sexual appetites were shaped by years of imprisonment in the palace's golden cage, a practice designed to prevent royal princes from threatening the throne by keeping them isolated from normal human contact. This confinement, which lasted from childhood until he was 25, created a psychological powder keg of repressed desires and distorted sexuality that exploded when he finally gained power. His first acts as sultan revealed a man whose understanding of human relationships had been completely corrupted by decades of enforced isolation. The emperor's obsession with obese women became legendary throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Ibrahim would send agents across his territories searching for the heaviest women they could find, offering enormous rewards for anyone who could locate females of sufficient size to satisfy his bizarre preferences. He maintained detailed catalogs of women's weights and measurements, treating human beings like livestock to be evaluated solely on their physical mass. His harem became a prison containing hundreds of women held against their will to satisfy his constant sexual demands. Unlike traditional Ottoman harems, which operated according to established protocols and hierarchies, Ibrahim's sexual quarters were scenes of constant terror, where women lived in fear of being selected for his attention. His sexual violence was so extreme that many women died from his assaults, creating a constant need to replenish his collection of victims. The most horrific crime of Ibrahim's reign occurred when his jealousy and paranoia convinced him that his concubines had been unfaithful. In a fit of rage that shocked even his most hardened advisors, the Sultan ordered the drowning of 280 women from his harem. These women were sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosporus, creating a mass murder that represented one of the largest single acts of gender-based violence in recorded history. The few women who survived this massacre did so through extraordinary courage and luck. One concubine managed to tear open her sack underwater and swim to safety, later providing testimony about the horror she had witnessed. Her survival allowed historians to document the full extent of Ibrahim's genocidal rage and the systematic nature of his violence against women. Ibrahim's sexual compulsions extended beyond his harem to include random women throughout Constantinople. He would order the kidnapping of women who caught his attention on the streets, in markets, or even in their homes. No woman was safe from his attention, creating a climate of fear throughout the capital where families lived in terror that their daughters, wives, or sisters might be selected for imperial rape. The Sultan's mental deterioration became so extreme that he began covering his palace walls with expensive furs, claiming that only the softest materials were suitable for his skin. This obsession with tactile sensation created enormous expense for the imperial treasury, while demonstrating his complete disconnection from normal human experience. The palace became a bizarre sensory environment designed to satisfy one man's diseased perceptions. Ibrahim's reign finally ended when his own government, horrified by his crimes and terrified of the empire's complete collapse, organized his assassination. His death came not from foreign enemies or popular rebellion, but from the recognition by his own advisors that allowing his madness to continue would destroy the Ottoman Empire itself. His murder represented one of the few cases in history where a government felt compelled to kill its own ruler to save the nation from complete destruction. Qin Shi Huang of China. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, transformed his obsession with achieving immortality into a systematic program of self-destruction that ultimately killed him, while demonstrating the complete corruption of human judgment by absolute power. Ruling from 259 to 210 BC, this monarch's pursuit of eternal life through the consumption of mercury and other toxic substances represents one of history's most ironic examples of how the fear of death can become the very cause of death. The emperor's terror of mortality began early in his reign and quickly evolved into a consuming obsession that affected every aspect of his governance. Qin Shi Huang employed armies of alchemists, physicians, and mystics whose sole responsibility was discovering the secret of eternal life. These supposed experts, terrified of disappointing their emperor, created increasingly elaborate and dangerous concoctions that they claimed would grant immortality to anyone brave enough to consume them. Mercury became the centerpiece of the emperor's immortality regimen, consumed daily in pills that were supposed to purify his body and grant eternal life. These mercury pills, prepared by court alchemists who understood nothing about the metal's toxic properties, were taken with religious devotion by an emperor who believed that swallowing poison was the path to godhood. The irony of consuming a deadly substance to avoid death was lost on a mind completely corrupted by the delusion of absolute power. The emperor's daily routine became centered around his immortality treatments, which included not only mercury consumption, but also bizarre dietary restrictions, exotic herbal preparations, and elaborate purification rituals. He would spend hours each day consuming various toxic substances that his alchemists claimed were essential for achieving eternal life. These sessions became formal ceremonies, attended by court officials who were forced to witness their emperor's slow suicide. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality extended to massive construction projects designed to ensure his eternal comfort. The famous Terracotta Army, while impressive as an archaeological discovery, was created by an emperor who genuinely believed he would need military protection in the afterlife. Thousands of workers died creating this elaborate fantasy, their lives sacrificed to support one man's deluded beliefs about death and eternity. The emperor's paranoia about assassination attempts led him to extreme secrecy about his location and activities. He would sleep in different palaces each night, travel in identical carriages to confuse potential assassins, and execute anyone who revealed information about his whereabouts. This paranoid lifestyle, combined with his daily mercury consumption, created a perfect storm of physical and psychological deterioration. The toxic effects of mercury poisoning began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior, violent mood swings, and physical symptoms that his court physicians were powerless to treat. The emperor's hands developed tremors, his speech became slurred, and his mental faculties deteriorated rapidly. Ironically, the very treatments he believed were granting him immortality were systematically destroying his body and mind. When Qin Shi Huang finally died from mercury poisoning during a journey to the eastern provinces, his death was so unexpected and feared by his advisors that they attempted to hide it from the empire. The emperor's body was transported back to the capital in a sealed carriage, with rotting fish loaded alongside the corpse to mask the smell of decomposition. This grotesque final journey represented the ultimate expression of an emperor whose pursuit of immortality had led him to become literally toxic, both in life and in death. Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. Adolf Fredrik of Sweden met his end in 1771 through what may be history's most absurd royal death, killed not by war, revolution, or assassination, but by an eating binge so extreme that it literally burst his digestive system. Known as the king who ate himself to death, Adolf Fredrik's final meal represents the ultimate expression of royal excess taken to its fatal conclusion. The circumstances leading to the king's death began with what should have been a pleasant royal dinner, celebrating Shrove Tuesday, a traditional pre-Lenten feast in Swedish culture. However, Adolf Fredrik approached this meal with an appetite that defied all reasonable limits, consuming quantities of food that would have challenged the digestive capacity of several normal people combined. Court records document the king's final meal in horrifying detail. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, and champagne were consumed in enormous quantities before Adolf Fredrik moved on to the dessert that would kill him. He consumed 14 servings of semla, traditional Swedish pastries filled with cream and almond paste, despite being already overfull from the massive quantities of rich food he had consumed earlier in the evening. The semla that killed the king were not ordinary pastries but elaborate confections designed to satisfy royal taste. Each serving contained heavy cream, thick almond paste, and sweet bread that absorbed liquids and expanded in the stomach. 14 of these rich, expanding desserts created a mass of food that his digestive system simply could not process, leading to what modern medicine would recognize as acute gastric rupture. The king's death was not immediate, but agonizingly prolonged, lasting several hours as his overstuffed stomach struggled to contain the enormous volume of food he had consumed. Palace physicians, summoned to treat what they initially thought was severe indigestion, quickly realized they were dealing with a medical emergency beyond their understanding or ability to treat. Medieval medicine offered no solutions for a king whose stomach had literally burst from overeating. Adolf Fredrik's agony during his final hours was witnessed by court officials who were horrified by the sight of their king dying from the consequences of his own gluttony. His pain was so extreme that he could not lie down, sit comfortably, or find any position that offered relief from the internal damage caused by his massive food consumption. The dignity of kingship was completely destroyed as the monarch writhed in agony from the effects of overeating. The psychological implications of the king's death extend beyond mere lack of self-control to reveal a man so disconnected from normal human limitations that he literally could not recognize when he had eaten enough to survive. This wasn't simply enjoying a large meal, it was a complete breakdown of the basic survival instincts that prevent most people from eating themselves to death. The international reaction to Adolf Fredrik's death was a mixture of shock and dark humor that damaged Sweden's reputation throughout Europe. Foreign courts struggled to comprehend how a monarch could die from overeating during peacetime, and the story became a cautionary tale about royal excess that was repeated throughout diplomatic circles for decades afterward. The king who ate himself to death became a symbol of the absurd extremes that royal privilege could reach when combined with a complete lack of self-restraint. Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII of England's final years represent one of the most grotesque transformations in royal history, as this once charismatic monarch devolved into a monstrous figure whose physical decay matched his psychological deterioration. By the end of his reign in 1547, Henry had become a walking corpse whose body was literally falling apart, while his mind consumed itself with paranoia, rage, and sexual obsession. The king's obesity had reached levels that challenged the structural capacity of Tudor architecture. Henry's weight, estimated at over 400 pounds, required special furniture, reinforced floors, and mechanical lifting devices to accommodate his massive bulk. He could no longer walk unassisted, instead requiring a team of servants to carry him in specially designed chairs or drag him upstairs using pulley systems. The very palace had to be reconstructed to support the physical presence of its king. His ulcerated leg became a festering wound that poisoned the air around him with its putrid stench. This open sore, possibly caused by a jousting accident years earlier, never healed properly and developed into a constantly weeping infection that could be smelled from across a room. The king's physicians, too terrified to suggest proper treatment, instead offered ineffective poultices and prayers, while the wound continued to rot his flesh. The psychological effects of constant pain and physical degradation transformed Henry into a monster of unpredictable violence. His famous temper, once merely intimidating, became genuinely terrifying as his physical agony drove him to extremes of cruelty that shocked even his most hardened courtiers. He would order executions on whims, sentence people to death for imaginary crimes, and fly into rages that left witnesses traumatized and fearful for their own lives. Henry's personal hygiene had deteriorated to levels that made him barely tolerable to be around. His clothes, stained with food, wine, and bodily fluids, were rarely changed because the process of undressing and redressing his massive, diseased body was so difficult and painful. The combination of his infected leg, poor hygiene, and digestive problems created a smell so overwhelming that courtiers would excuse themselves from his presence to vomit. The king's sexual behavior became increasingly desperate and pathetic as his physical condition deteriorated. Despite his massive size, infected wounds, and advancing age, Henry continued to pursue sexual encounters with a desperation that reflected his terror of mortality. His attempts at seduction became grotesque parodies of romance, with potential partners horrified by the prospect of physical intimacy with the diseased king. Henry's eating habits continued to be excessive, even as his body struggled to process food properly. He would consume enormous meals while suffering from what were probably symptoms of diabetes, creating a cycle where his appetite remained enormous while his body's ability to handle food decreased. Meals became public spectacles of gluttony that disgusted foreign visitors and demonstrated the king's complete loss of dignity. The most grotesque aspect of Henry VIII's legacy was revealed after his death when his coffin burst open during transport to his burial site. The king's body had begun decomposing so rapidly that the gases produced by putrefaction literally exploded his coffin, spilling his liquefied remains onto the floor of the church, where dogs were later observed licking up the fluids. This final humiliation completed the transformation of a once powerful king into something barely recognizable as human. Conclusion. The 11 monarchs whose stories we have examined represent more than historical curiosities or examples of individual mental illness. They demonstrate a fundamental truth about human nature that remains relevant today. When human beings are given unlimited power over others, when no one can say no to their demands or challenge their decisions, the result is not enlightened leadership, but the systematic destruction of their humanity. Each of these rulers began their reigns as recognizably human beings, but the isolation and unchecked authority of absolute power gradually stripped away their sanity, their moral compass, and ultimately, their basic humanity. James I's filth, Charles VI's glass delusion, Peter III's toy obsession, and the sexual violence of Ibrahim the Mad all represent different expressions of the same fundamental breakdown, the corruption of human psychology by unlimited authority. The pattern that emerges from these cases is disturbingly consistent across cultures, centuries, and political systems. Absolute power creates a psychological environment where normal feedback mechanisms disappear, where consequences for destructive behavior are eliminated, and where the ruler becomes trapped in an echo chamber of their own increasingly distorted perceptions. Without external constraints or genuine criticism, the human mind appears incapable of maintaining its connection to reality, Perhaps most disturbing is how these monarchs' madness affected millions of innocent people who had no choice but to endure the consequences of their rulers' psychological breakdown. While James I rotted in his own filth, England's government struggled to function. While Charles VI cowered in fear of his imaginary glass body, France faced military defeats and political chaos. While Ibrahim drowned hundreds of women, the Ottoman Empire's resources were squandered on his sexual obsessions. The human cost of royal madness extended far beyond the palace walls to encompass entire civilizations whose development was stunted, whose resources were wasted, and whose people suffered under the weight of their rulers' diseased minds. Human psychology recognizes many of these behaviors as symptoms of severe mental illness that could potentially be treated with therapy, medication, and social support. However, the structure of absolute monarchy made treatment impossible because acknowledging the ruler's illness would undermine the entire system of government. The very institution that created these monsters also made their recovery impossible. The legacy of these mad kings serves as a warning about the fundamental incompatibility between unlimited power and human sanity. Their stories demonstrate that absolute authority doesn't just corrupt, it systematically destroys the human capacity for rational thought, moral judgment, and basic social behavior. In the end, unlimited power proves fatal not only to those who wield it, but to the civilizations unfortunate enough to be ruled by the monsters it creates.